Okay, good morning. So, got some great feedback about my last video. So today I'm going to do another one, maybe a few more days until I can get to a third one. But I was intrigued by a question I received, and it's something that I really want to talk about. And so I will do my very best to keep this one much shorter, to the point, and also these are conversations we're going to have over and over again, I'm sure, or if you care to join me. Talk about race. Americans do not know how to talk about race. And you would think for a country as diverse as ours, but also where, I think many Americans, at least where I live, I interact with people of other races every day. And in fact, I know many people who, to some extent, even I know that in my background, there's more than one race. That's very common in the South, that you have people with multiple ethnic backgrounds, multiple, people who are, have a black ancestor, or an Indian ancestor, or Hispanic ancestor, or white European ancestor, or something like that. And so I'd be really honest and tell you that I don't like using racial terms when I talk about people, because I don't really think that that's, one, it's something people can't help. You cannot help the circumstances of your birth or your background. What you can help and what you can affect is what you do with it. And so that's the first thing. The second thing, I'm just going to throw out some books and things like that kind of help me understand these things. There's a wonderful book called Free Speech for Me, But Not for Thee, by a man named Nat Hentoff. And I think Mr. Hentoff may have passed away some years ago. But he was an attorney for the ACLU. And this is back when the ACLU actually stood for free speech and things of that nature. And before it, now they only, if it's politically correct, they'll defend it, and if it's not, they won't. The ACLU, in fact, I think he may have been involved. Just to give you an example, the American Nazi Party wanted to march through Skokie, Illinois, which is a city outside of Chicago, and a large number of Jewish residents lived there, obviously, and also many of them had connections to the Holocaust. And the ACLU defended the right of the American Nazi Party to assemble and march through Skokie. That was the freedom of assembly. That's the First Amendment, right? Your civil liberties are derived from the First Amendment. I don't think the ACLU would do that today, but Mr. Hentoff, I believe, was involved in that litigation. And so Free Speech for Me, But Not for Thee by Nat Hentoff. Another great book, if you ever get a chance to read it, is The New Jim Crow. It talks about mass incarceration, the prison industry, and it also talks about politics. And many of the people who today, have assumed certain levels of political power in the United States, even people within the Democratic Party, owe much of their success to the mass incarceration of huge numbers of black males. And I don't think that, well, let me get to that in just a second, if I may, because there's one last thing I want to talk about. When I think about race in America, there's an event that occurred in my life that dramatically changed the way I view race in the United States. And first of all, let me, full disclosure, and I'll always try to point this out, these are my personal opinions and perspectives. Feel free to disagree with them. But something I want to point out from the get-go, anytime we talk about race, the danger is that if someone disagrees with the prevailing narrative, you risk ostracization. You risk being labeled a racist or a this or a that. That automatically precludes a solution. People can and should disagree about matters of race and racial justice. And it's not an for it or against it, or a black versus white. That's a false dichotomy. That is a logical fallacy. It's much more complex than that. And so I want to talk briefly about that. I was born and raised in the South. I'm the descendant of Confederate ancestors. I can take you not far up the road here and show you where both of them fought and were captured. One at Spanish Fort and one at a place called Blakely. They were poor white men who, I think one of them was probably a teenager, probably about 14, 15 years old. The other one's maybe 18 to 21. And their country was attacked. The way they understood the world was that their homes were being attacked by the federal armies. And they, I'm quite sure people knew what Sherman and others had done in Georgia and places up north. And so, of course, when they came into Alabama, politics be damned, you're going to fight for your home. So they were poor. They were probably illiterate. They probably couldn't read and write very well. And I think they went on to become sharecroppers, and also they collect turpentine. And so when I think about race, and I think about the Civil War, and I think about slavery, that's one part that informs my judgment of these things. The second thing is that I grew up around black people. I went to school with them. I rode the bus with them. My neighbors are black. I go to a church that's highly integrated. And so I'm always interested when I hear about issues of race and everything. I don't really care too much about what people from, some celebrity, some actor, some entertainer, some athlete, or some politician thinks. I'm granted they have opinions, I respect their opinions, but what I care about is what the local reality is. Because the local reality typically is different. People live and interact with each other on a daily basis, and they understand each other. I don't care when I hear about, some politician from up north, or somebody, come in and just, you guys are this, that. Well, I would recommend they maybe look a little bit closer to home. Keep in mind, some of the worst race riots of the 1970s weren't in the South. They were up north. Places like Boston, Massachusetts. Okay, places like where Senator Elizabeth Warren lives. And we all know that she has a pretty complex racial history herself, doesn't she? Race has been exploited for political gain by both sides. That angers me. Because what that means is that they are turning Americans against Americans. Now, the third thing I'll say about race is this, is that I gained a new insight into race when I served in Liberia. Okay, Liberia, most people think Liberia was a colony of the United States. Well, no, it was never a colony of the United States government. It was set up by the American Colonization Society. And there were many reasons it was set up. One, they were concerned about slave revolts after what had happened in Haiti and other parts, even here in the United States, in the South. There was also a concern that as black people became free, that they would take jobs from white people, that they would intermarry, that there would be mixing of the races. And so this is even people up north. I mean, keep in mind, the South and the North, both sides are complicit in slavery, very much complicit. The North made a lot of money off of it. Brown University, the Brown brothers, were slave traders. Harvard University owes some of its financial success to the slave trade. And so they set up the American Colonization Society. They went in with the assistance of the U.S. Navy and helped establish this colony and then removed themselves. But one thing I noticed about Liberia is, you travel around Liberia, you see a lot of relics of the American South. And there was a man I became friends with, and his last name, I can't remember his specific last name, but the thing I remember most about him was that his mother was a Howard. Howard was a common surname in Liberia. And we were talking one time, we were having lunch, and he said, my ancestors, he said, you're of English descent and this, that, and something else. He said, but I'm an American. I'm an American. My descendants are Americans. And I thought, we have a group of people here whose background, whose the roots that connect them to the world and to their history was just totally uprooted and eradicated through evil, through violence. Howard is not the name of his ancestor. It's the name of it's the name one of his ancestors took after the Civil War, probably. But I thought, this man has been his lineage was taken from him. The gift of his background was stolen through violence. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about Confederate monuments and some of these other things. And please, once again, I'll try to keep it short, but also, if you have further questions, I'd love to discuss this more because I think this is such a critical issue for Americans to understand. I've noticed that the left, and I don't want to beat up too much on the left because the right has its errors too, but the left tends to label people. That anytime you begin to move an argument, well, you're racist, or you're this, or a chauvinist, or a homophobe, or something. Well, no, maybe we just have different opinions and perspectives on things. And so, I'm just going to try to keep this very short. Let's talk a little bit about military bases. There are 10 Army facilities, 10 Army bases that are under the latest National Defense Authorization Act, that they're going to change the names of these bases. And they're named for a variety of Confederate generals. Some things to think about with this. I'm always reluctant to name something after a person, okay? Especially somebody like a high-ranking military officer or a politician, because these typically kind of can be very flawed people, okay? I think it's right to name them after people who received the Medal of Honor or something like that, because that's a hero. But people who can climb to the top of the political ladder or the military ladder, I don't necessarily imbue them with heroic attributes. I mean, granted, there are some who are worthy of our respect and admiration, definitely, for their professional achievements. But then again, I'm also reluctant to do that because find me the hypothetically perfect person does not exist. So there are 10 bases that are named after Confederate generals, I believe. Bragg, Polk, Rucker, A.P. Hill, I believe. And so, something I think about with that, these bases were begun around 1917. As the United States entered World War I, and then also when the U.S. entered World War II, as we were entering World War II. And so it was this massive expansion of the U.S. military, specifically the U.S. Army. And they were in the South. And so back in 2015, the Pentagon said, we're not going to rename these facilities because this was done in a spirit of reconciliation. Granted, that's probably a pretty valid point, but something I would point out was that 1915, there was a movie called Birth of a Nation, and it glamorized the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. And it really went again, talked about, it showed Reconstruction and freed slaves abusing white women, and how the KKK was this heroic organization. And this movie, it came out in 1915, and it really impressed large segments of the white population and kind of led to a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. President Woodrow Wilson, saw it and thought it was the bomb diggity. I mean, he praised it and said it was real. And President Wilson, of course, was at one point he was a hero of the Democratic Party. So the KKK was very powerful, specifically in the South. Okay, black people didn't get a vote in the naming of those bases. That occurred at a time in our country's history when huge segments of our population were relegated to maybe almost subhuman status because of their race. And I think that we need to seriously review that and think about the justice of these bases, the names these bases have. And so there's that piece. And then, something else I want to talk about just really quick. Remember, how we understood things, how people understood things back then was very different. I don't think these bases were meant to stick around for 50, 60, 70 years or whatever. At the time, once again, the KKK was very powerful. Robert Byrd, senator from West Virginia, was a member of the KKK. Justice Hugo Black, one of the first justices appointed by President Roosevelt, was a member of the KKK. And so the naming of those bases occurred in a context that is repulsive to all of us. It should propel anyone today. That a part of our population, Americans, a segment of American society, people, our fellow citizens, were denied their voice in choosing those names. So let's fast forward now. 43% of the U.S. military, according to Pew Research, is minority, is non-white. It's and once again, I really don't like using racial language because it's such a problematic thing. I mean, what is white? What is black? What is Asian? I don't know. I don't teach my children to label people with black or white or something like that. We're all kind of different shades of color. That's the way God made us. And so 43% of the American military belongs to a racial minority. So, I care about that. I care, I want, do they feel a certain sense of intimidation? Do they feel a certain sense of, do they feel second class when they go to these bases or they serve on these bases? Once again, I care about what the people in that context, what people on those bases think about that. What's the reality they face? Do they, if I'm serving at Fort Bragg, do I feel relegated because of my race? Things change though. And what I mean by that is that, names change. Not names change, but the meaning of something changes. So for instance, Penny, okay, I think his name was James Penny. He was a merchant, ship owner or something in Liverpool, England. He was very successful, made a lot of money. And so there's a street in Liverpool called Penny Lane. Well, Penny was also involved in the slave trade and made a lot of money from it. So if we live in Liverpool today, are we offended by this place called Penny Lane? Or do we think about Penny Lane and we think about, that's a Beatles song. Now, do we go ahead and change the name of Penny Lane to simply remove the connection it has with Mr. Penny? Or do we say, what, that was a reality that needs to be examined and something from which we need to learn and move on? Or do we say, what, we're just going to change the name? And when you do that, you take away a piece of our culture. You take away a piece of what it means to be from Liverpool, to be a Liverpudlian. You cut out that piece, that happy connection that the people of Liverpool have with Penny Lane, because there's a really wonderful Beatles song about it. There are people I know who've served at Fort Bragg and Fort Jackson and Fort Polk and all these other places, and I don't know how significant the name or the person behind the name is compared to the experience they had at Fort Bragg, Fort Polk, Fort Jackson. And it worries me because we haven't even had that discussion. We haven't even done that type of inspection or examination of our own conscience. So, once again, I'll say this: I would prefer that we not name bases after generals and people like that and politicians, because these people typically turn out to be pretty flawed. Later on in life, we learn that hey, they did something that we would now find improper, immoral, wrong. So that's one thing. Oh, you know what? And now that I think about it, just one more thing I want to talk about. It's not just military bases. Do we rename the Woodrow Wilson Bridge? Well, President Wilson, yes, he had some pretty bad ideas about race. He reintroduced segregation in so many parts of our society. He set us back. But yet, then again, that's a fact. The fact was President Wilson was president from 1913 to 1921, right? He was president during World War I. The League of Nations, the 14 points. Some of the best ideas we have for the political left on foreign affairs come from President Wilson, the Wilsonian School of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. And so, do we throw the baby out with the bathwater when we do that? Do we simply... Is our assessment of a person based solely or disproportionately on the worst parts of his thinking or his behavior? And that's the question we need to ask. I think that we do ourselves a disservice when we apply such a harsh approach. I think it's be much more instructive to understand the realities of the slave trade and what happened to black people in America. And not just black people, but also Native Americans and others. One thing I'm fascinated with is this idea of truth and reconciliation commissions, which I learned about in Liberia. And I think that we would do well to have such a commission in the United States to study race and study, what happened. How did race get to where it is in America today? I also think that people who are descended from slaves, I think we owe them an apology. I think our government was complicit in this slave trade, which is an evil. It's an affront to God. It's an affront to human dignity to buy, sell, trade, and harm other humans for financial gain. But I also think that slavery was much more complex, and there were so many facets of it that politicians, when they talk about this, when Senator Elizabeth Warren talks about these are figures of hate, or when Speaker Pelosi talks about these are hate. Well, you know what? That language right there automatically abbreviates or truncates our understanding, because we've simply labeled it as hate. And there are deeper realities there. And I find quite often people who are so vehement about these things typically are people who, well, to be honest with you, I've noticed some of the most racist language and ideas I've ever heard in private have come from people I know who are on the political left. They live in all-white neighborhoods. Some of these places have gates. Their children go to schools that are predominantly upper class and white. They don't have daily interaction with people of other socioeconomic classes. And that bothers me, because these people shouldn't be defining the reality for everybody. I think there's a deeper and greater reality where most people live. Most of us live in the middle. Most of us work with and love people of other races every day. And I don't need somebody whose existence is so sheltered and so, self-focused, telling me, defining for me what my, the morality of my racial views. Okay? And so that's one thing I wish that we would get away from in our society. We need to recapture the dialogue, and we need to learn how to talk about race again. I'm going to go really quick and just kind of highlight one thing, because here locally, I live in Pensacola, Florida. Let's talk about that. So we had a Confederate statue downtown near Cervantes and Palafox Street, and it was put up in the 1890s, and it was a monument to the Confederate dead. And once again, I am not denying that this occurred at a time of Jim Crow. This occurred at a time when black people did not have a voice. But then again, things change. Okay, the statue, there were trees all around it and everything. You really couldn't, you kind of had to make an effort to go find it. And I don't think most people cared too much about it. It was just a fact, just like, you go down the same street, you go down Palafox Street, right? And there's Martin Luther King Plaza, and there's a bust of Dr. King. And don't think you should tear down statues. I think you should build the picture, expand the picture. Have people engage in dialogue rather than taking it down, okay? But I believe that much of what caused that statue to come down wasn't so much what most people, black, white, in Pensacola thought. I think it was a response to, certain, financial interests in Pensacola said, hey, we should bring this thing down because we don't want to be the subject of a boycott, and we want to put forward this ultra-progressive image that we are so hip and new and everything that we're going to get rid of the statue. I don't believe in destroying statues, okay? That's what John Calvin did, okay? That's what the Taliban did to the Buddhas in Bamiyan back in 2000, I believe. Blowing up statues, tearing things down, trying to erase a historical fact, even though it may be very unpleasant. The problem with that is this. When that is a slippery slope. That type of action is zero-sum. That statue comes down, and they say they're going to put it up somewhere else. But there's a winner and there's a loser. We cannot survive as a people if we have only winners and only losers. We cannot survive as a people if we say, you know what, we're going to take this piece of our history and we're going to bury it or we're going to tear it down and we're going to label it. No, you need to go back and you need to talk about it and figure it out and expand the picture, as unpleasant as it may be. So let's just follow this out. This is my concern. And then I'm going to say this, and I'll maybe a few years from now we'll see if it comes true. So Pensacola calls itself the city of five flags, right? The Spanish, the French, the British, Confederates, and the Americans, the United States. Woohoo, love America. So that was begun, I think, about 49 by the Pensacola Chamber of Commerce, and something like that, as a way to promote the city of five flags. Okay, well, let me ask you a question. And I ask this of those who, in Pensacola, I live in Escambia County, so I keep all that, keep Pensacola down there. Stephen Mallory, there's Mallory Street. Well, Stephen Mallory was the Secretary of the Navy for the Confederacy. Do we now change the name of Mallory Street? Let's see what else. We have multiple streets named after Spaniards. We have DeLuna. Okay, DeLuna, Tristan DeLuna started the first settlement here in Pensacola, in Florida, in the 1500s. It was hit by a hurricane, had to be abandoned. But, I'm pretty sure when DeLuna came here that he had, I don't think his motives were necessarily, hey, I'm going to go here and do all kinds of altruistic things. I mean, he came here to help subjugate this place, this land, and the people who lived here, the Indians at the time, to Spanish rule. The Spaniards did terrible things. And yet, if you go down to Pensacola, there are Spanish colonial flags flying. The flag, under that flag, thousands and thousands of indigenous people died in the Americas. And yet, the city of Pensacola has it on its seal. They fly it. It's on their police badges. Because we're the city of five flags, right? The French. The French did some pretty terrible things too. The British did some pretty terrible things. The British introduced slavery to Jamestown in the early 1600s. I mean, the British, helped kill Indians. They gave them blankets laden with smallpox. And yet, we fly British flags in Pensacola. We fly the French colonial flag in Pensacola. The Confederacy. Okay, well, I think we've talked a little bit about the Confederacy too. And so, well, are we going to go down now, change the names of all these streets? Are we going to go down and remove these flags? We have this, City of Five Flags. We have the DeLuna Festival. And, many city leaders line up to participate in that. In fact, when you go to that festival, there are people who dress as Indians, okay? They call, I think, the Maoki Indians. I'm not beating up on you, but I'm saying that, that's cultural appropriation. That's wrong. You should not do that. How dare you? This kind of aggression, this zero sum, all or nothing. It's take it down. What it's going to do is eventually cost us something as a culture and as a people. And the other thing I don't like about it is it teaches us that there's no room for dialogue. Take it down, end it. Don't discuss it. Don't examine it, and don't tolerate it. Okay, you have to learn how to tolerate things, right? Isn't that what we talk about? So, for instance, there are certain flags that maybe I find repulsive. Maybe I don't, maybe I don't agree with the ideology of a certain flag. But you know what? This is America. I have to learn to live with that. Maybe I don't like rainbow flags, or maybe I don't like, POW MIA flags, or maybe I don't like Confederate flags. But in the United States of America, you kind of have the right to fly whatever flag you wish. Now, what bothers me is when the government picks and chooses winners and losers. And, that's done by politicians. And I don't have a very high opinion of politicians. I think most of them are opportunistic. And I don't look for courage or moral clarity from the political class of this country. It's just not going to happen. Make sure I got my notes here. I think we're good. Oh, yeah, last thing. And I just want to talk about this. Things the names and the meanings of things can change. The significance, the impact things have can change. And so I would offer to you this. Doak Campbell was president of Florida State University. Doak Campbell, as I understand it, was in favor of segregation of educational facilities. There have been people who said we should remove the name of Doak Campbell from the stadium. Well, okay, well, I got that. I agree that, granted, President Campbell had he had some bad ideas about the world. I understand that. And I think that did terrible damage to black people in Florida. So, but in doing that, do you somehow or another take something away from everybody? Do we take something away from everybody who's ever attended a ball game at Doak Campbell, the Doak? When I married my wife almost 22 years ago in Gainesville, the first thing I saw when I came out of the church was the George Smathers Library, like right there, for the University of Florida. Well, George Smathers, I think, ran against Claude Pepper for the U.S. Senate. Smathers ran an extremely racist campaign. Do we change the name of that? Or does it mean something different now? Just how many people who are in the Smathers Library right now studying, which they should be doing, I hope. How many Gators know who George Smathers was? Quite often we name things after people for, once again, this is why we should never, I'm really reluctant to name things after people who donate a lot of money or are politically connected, because you're going to find that they are very flawed people. Okay? You don't make millions of dollars by being a saint. You don't climb to the top of the political food chain through altruism. But do those things mean something different? And what bothers me is that I think we're in such a rush to change names and tear things down now that we're not having that kind of examination of what kind of society we want to be. I think that's something we all need to do. Last thing I'll say, and then I want to wrap it all up. In 2027, some FBI files will be released, and I think 2027, and they're wiretaps and recordings of Dr. Martin Luther King. And the FBI ran an illegal surveillance campaign against him back in the 60s. And according to some scholars, there's a significant amount of evidence that Dr. King was involved in sexual violence against women. When this comes out, how do we address that? Do we go down to King Plaza and eliminate that bust of Dr. King? Do we change the name of MLK Drive? Does this man's behavior, or this representation of his behavior, change his ideals and his impact on our country? We're going to celebrate his birthday, I think, on Monday. I think we need to have that understanding. People are great. Sometimes people are more than their worst behaviors. Their impact is different than their worst ideals or ideas. John F. Kennedy, notorious womanizer. There's some evidence that John F. Kennedy, did things that nowadays would put him in jail. His sexual appetites. But yet, we're building a ship and we're going to call it the USS John F. Kennedy. The USS Lyndon B. Johnson. Well, Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson. Listen to the tapes of him talking in the White House. Listen to some of the language he uses. Is this really the kind of person we want to name a ship after? So, I guess the last thing, just the way to wrap it up is this really quickly, ladies and gentlemen, if I may. And once again, please feel free to, ask questions, disagree with me if you may. We need to learn how to talk about issues of race and issues of history and issues of relationships among different types of people in this country. You cannot do that if it automatically begins with you're labeling other people as filled with hate or ignorant, or they automatically get labeled with some type of ist or an obe or something like that. There's a greater reality here. And I don't, what this conversation really is it's turned into an, either or. And you can't live that way. we can't survive as a society that way. So please feel free to comment. I look forward to hearing from you. I love every one of you, and I'm honored to be with you and serve you, and have served with many of you. And we're all Americans, and that is the greatest privilege in the world. So God bless you, and God bless our country. Thanks so much.